We are starting this new series with our global ambassador, Dr. Brian Stiller. Brian has been around with the WEA for more than 10 years now, and he has written lots and lots of books. But one book that has been very interesting for a young leader like me to read has been this book called The Seven Ancient Principles for the 21st Century Leaders. I see that I'm not the only one that finds this book interesting. So firstly, thank you for downloading the book. If you have not yet downloaded the book, please feel free to download the book through the link. Um, we will be looking at a principle each webinar, so we will try very hard to keep within the theme of the principle. You are welcome to, of course, ask any questions, but please be please know that that's what we will try to answer only via the principles. Please feel free to also send us notes. We will try and respond, or Brian will try and respond, and we will do this within an hour. So without further ado, Brian, I would love to have you share with us a bit of your insights on how did you even come about writing a book like this, Seven Ancient Principles for the 21st Century.
Well, thank you, Parong. It's morning in Canada. So those of you that are at a different time of the day, good day. Thank you for joining us. This idea emerged through my life. Just a quick biographical sketch. I was born very young, some 82 years ago, out on the prairies of Saskatchewan. That's the western part of Canada, which is known for its great farms and ranches. My father was a pastor, and so I was raised in a church home. There were five of us in the family. I went to a denominational college, and then went on. Then my wife and I were married. We met at that school. Married. We just celebrated our 61st wedding anniversary. We moved from Western Canada to Toronto, where I did my undergraduate in history and philosophy at the University of Toronto, and then went on and did my graduate work there, and then eventually did doctoral work in the Boston area. But the early years, I had great aspirations for ministry. Of the five siblings, I was the one that chose church-related ministry, and so that's what I did, and prepared myself for it. Thought I was preparing myself for a preaching ministry. And so following university, my wife and I, this is back in the mid 60s. So if you can cast your mind back that far, in our Canadian society, in our church community, both our denominational and interdenominational life, preaching rallies were a common thing. It was quite popular, and so I was a young preacher. My wife and I, we did music, and I say we did our dog and pony show all across the country. But I was finding that my struggles. I found I was struggling in that, and I was in my mid-20s, so I didn't know very much. Thought I knew more than I really did. And during that time, my wife announced that she is expecting our first child. Well, tramping the country, first with a wife that's expecting and then anticipating having a family, those didn't match. And so I considered, what is the Lord saying? In that time, I had opportunities in various ways, but I accepted a role with a youth movement called Youth for Christ. Youth for Christ was a youth movement that was begun in the US by Billy Graham, and then he helped promote it worldwide. And then it was started in Canada. And in my boyhood years in Saskatoon, the Saturday night Youth for Christ rally was for me the every 2 weeks was the best moment. I loved the Youth for Christ interdenominational environment, the music, the preaching. I thought was the best. So when this youth movement invited me to come to Montreal as director, it seemed the right thing to do, and I ended up doing that. Now, I tell you that story to say that the Lord leads along the way. The old line, the King James version, being in, or the old language said, interpreted the scriptures by saying this: being in the way the Lord led. And the implication is, of course, the Lord leads a moving object. And with that, the moving object is what God does lead us as we move, not as we stand still. That's a long answer to a short question, Parong.
No, that's fine. We are here to listen to you, so please go for it. I want to just I like very much what you said a lot. You need to be in movement. But at the same time, in this principle, it's about listening, and listening is a lot to do with reflection and being still. So from your perspective, when do we be in movement, and where does listening happen in that movement?
Listening is a learned talent. I find that generally people who have the leadership skill are so much driven by accomplishment that they don't listen to. We aren't, and I'm speaking personally, of course. We aren't personally oriented towards being good listeners. Being an activist with a heart and a view to accomplish something, my life tends to be shaped around that. And that guides me into being active and descriptive of what we're going to do, but not so much listening and listening to others. So I learned, and I learned by colleagues looking at me and saying, "Stiller, shut up and listen. Just listen." And so often I find that I discipline myself by looking at a person and just keeping my mouth shut and listening. But the broader issue of listening is to become aware of what is around me. Again, I'm making some assumptions here. So let me describe. The assumption is that leaders often, as I noted, are driven to accomplish. They believe what they believe. They know what they know. They choose what they choose, and they push forward on that level. But often that removes the context from our awareness, from our learning, from our knowledge, from intuitively gaining to ourselves what the world in which we are a part of. And so I'm asking us in the moment of activity. Let me just move this for a moment. We've got some activity here, and I didn't realize we were going to have this activity, and I need just to change my position so it's more comfortable. Sorry.
That's fine. We have a tour of your house, your cottage.
There we go. So
Yeah.
learning to listen to the people around me, the noise of my culture, the anguish of people's hearts, the objection that people will have to who I am or what I do or what I think, ideas that are outside of my own learned experience or my own inclination to understand. So I had to learn to listen and to read, to hear people that I would not normally hear, to watch broadcasts that are polar opposite to my political, social interests, and just to develop a skill in listening to others. There's another aspect to this. So often, and I'm sure you've observed this, is that you'll be in a setting where there is a person who is leading, and somebody else is sitting there wanting to tell their story, and their story is not told because the dominant person, or the person who's regarded as the leader, doesn't give the opportunity for that person to tell their story. And so learning to listen is a lifelong experience, a lifelong discipline, and it's an experience that really was pushed on me. We can get into, when we get into the issue of gifts, I can be a little more explicit on that.
Thank you very much. I'm gone a bit to the topic, but now let's go back up a bit. You write this book about Nehemiah. I'm curious for you, why write a book about Nehemiah? Why did this story so much grip and inform you?
Of Nehemiah?
Yep.
I love Bible stories. My childhood, my favorite time of the day was the evening. And Mom would gather us 5 kids around her and read us Bible stories. And in fact, she discovered that the most effective discipline was to deny me the Bible story if I had been naughty during the day. And I love Bible stories. And the story of Nehemiah gradually emerged, but it emerged specifically in this way. I had spent, so I told you, Lily and I were married. We had our first child. I started with Youth for Christ, serving their chapter in Montreal. And then that had emerged into other Youth for Christ activities. And then I became the national director, Canadian director for Youth for Christ. And I was this was 15, 16 years later. And I had been invited to a lovely church in Vancouver. It was a large church. It had a weekly television show. It had everything that matched my ego. Let me just do a parenthetical here. When I started out, my aspiration was to be a preacher, to be a good preacher. And I felt that this was my calling. But I discovered that I wasn't being asked to come back. And that was a clear mark that my sense of calling others didn't appreciate or agree with. And so I ended up in leading this national organization. I knew it was time to leave, and so I was at that stage. And so when this church invited me, I thought that was a natural migration for us. So I took a few days, went to a friend's chalet north of Toronto, and I did something what I'd never done before. I just took my Bible and a notepad, and I began to read at the beginning of the Bible text and just slowly worked my way through it. Some chapters I would miss, other things my eye would catch and I would read. And through the day, I ended up in Nehemiah. And I'll read the whole text. And I read through. And I looked at my notes when I'd finished. And I had written, find a broken wall. Find a broken wall that no one cares about. Find a broken wall that people make fun of. But find a broken wall. Well, I had no idea what that meant. That was my real introduction. I knew Nehemiah, read him, but never had allowed his life to envelop my circumstance. And so I phoned the church, the chair of the board, and I said, I can't come. They said, well, why not? So I told them what I had just been through, and they said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I have no idea. No idea. Well, intercepting our lives, of course, all the time is the Spirit of God. I operate with that as that's as an operating principle, being in the way the Lord leads. And he does lead. He leads in ways that absolutely surprises us. And so when I didn't know what to do, I got a call from a friend. He was a Baptist minister. I love to say it's amazing how God can use a Baptist now and then. And he called and he had heard about this opportunity to this church. And he said, Brian, that's the absolutely wrong thing to do. And I said, well, interesting. I just called and said, we wouldn't be coming. So I said, Merv, if God told you what I shouldn't do, maybe he told you what I should do. And that into a conversation with taking up the Canadian Evangelical Alliance, which was a series of files in somebody's drawer, and beginning with that. So obviously, Nehemiah had such a he was so influential in causing me to stop and not do what I thought I should or wanted to do, but to consider something else. That Nehemiah then became my friend, and I would read him frequently, preach from the text, and gradually began to see these principles that applied to me. It applied to my circumstance. And I found, Parang, that this metaphor of find a broken wall became a bit prophetic in my life. And so I have found over the years that the ministries that I have been a part of have been those that basically organizations that have either faltered or gone bankrupt. And my role has been to come and to take and to resolve the conflicts and to re-envision and then to rebuild. So there's where Nehemiah has been so both elementary and structural to my sense of calling and my learning about what's involved as I came to realize that leadership was my dominant gift.
Thank you. Since you call Nehemiah your friend and you've spent lots of your time mining the story of Nehemiah, I think it would be great from your perspective to give us a short understanding, a quick outline of this story from your perspective, the big overtures and stuff like that. Could you share with us from your perspective the story of Nehemiah?
Yeah, Nehemiah, of course, was a Hebrew. He was an expatriate. He was in Babylon with King Nebuchadnezzar, and so pardon me, I'm sorry, I looked at it. I looked at a text and my mind went in the wrong direction. Xerxes was the king of Persia, now Iran, and Nehemiah had become senior. Cupbearer means senior advisor, and one profoundly trusted by the king. And the king was in a vulnerable state. Enemies of all kinds in and outside of his administration. And so one day, when Artaxerxes was in leadership, Nehemiah's brother came and told him of the story of the condition of the Hebrews in Jerusalem and how the Hebrews were caught not only being ridiculed by their enemies, but the walls of Jerusalem had broken, and of course, the protection of the holy city was strategic and key. And it was in that moment that Nehemiah realized that for him, the heart of his life would be in rebuilding that wall. Nehemiah was strategic. He went to the king in a particular way to garner from him support. And then in the process, he asked the king for a variety of things, which allowed him then to make the move to Jerusalem with permission and with resources and authority to go about the rebuilding of the wall. So that, in essence, is the story. And the lessons learned along the way relate to the kinds of things that he strategically did to serve his people.
Great, thank you. So I want to pick up on what you said about Nehemiah. For him, the heart of his life is to build the wall. In many ways, this is what he listened to, right, as the problem of the lifetime, or this is his listening. But as the cupbearer, Nehemiah would have heard many other stories, would have had many other people tell him things that is good to do. So I guess this is a good time for me to ask, from your perspective, how do we discern what is the heart of our life when we have so many things that we are listening to?
I think one begins.
I think from.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go. No, I was going to say this perhaps is something to do with the whole gifting idea that you have put in the book.
Yeah. Listening, of course, embodies listening to your own interests, your own comfort zone, what other people are saying. So when somebody says, well, what's God's will for my life? I begin with asking the question, what do you like doing? And people say, well, what does that have to do with what God has for me? Well, the logic, I think, is quite simple. What I like to do is probably what I do best. And what I do best indicates probably what I'm best at doing. There's not a leap of logic there, is there? And if that's what I'm best at doing, that's possibly what I've been gifted as dominant in my life. And I think it's also logical to assume that what God has gifted us to do, he would want us to use those gifts in life. So begin with, what do you like to do? What do you like doing best? What gets you up in the morning? What activates your interest? What calls your attention? Listen to yourself. I have found this, that if there is a need, there's an opportunity, or there's a request, and that it creates a bit of anxiety for me, it may indicate that's not in my toolkit. It's not a strength of mine. So I find, begin with what you do best, and then ask other people how they view you. I'll never forget, it was a moment with Lily and I had dinner with two other couples. And I was in this journey. I was with Youth for Christ. I had come out of this period of my early years of preaching and finding that I really didn't like it and wasn't appreciated as I thought I should have been. And then I was invited to be with this Youth for Christ in Montreal, and I arrived there and they were bankrupt. The leader had left and it was bankrupt. And I was in a foreign city, French speaking and English at that. My French very inadequate. And I was a prairie boy in this large city with an organization that was in bankruptcy and ministry that I had not been trained to do. And so over my initial years, I just got up and just did what I thought should be done that day. And had a small group of board members that were encouraging. And so I found in the process that I was able to do things on the leadership level and organizational level that seemed to resonate with others. But a few years later, as we were having dinner with these friends, I was introduced to the idea of gifting. Now, remember, this is back in the late 60s. So gifting was a new idea as a framing of one's personality and calling. And as we had that dinner, I realized that I had a gifting that I had never understood particularly as being a gifting or something that was particularly resonant within my own skills and my journey. And that was a defining moment. And that's when I came to understand the framing of gifting and how that gifting would experience would lead to experience in ministry.
Thank you. So I hear there is the need to have gifts, or you listen based on your gifts. What do I like to do? And God has given me these gifts, and so I should work out these gifts. I also hear you mention twice the topic of ego. Um, my question to you is, how do we navigate ego in gifts? Because, like you say, this is what I potentially do best in. And so think that it is all on me to do really well in it. And of course that can very quickly become an ego trip. How does listening and ego and gifts, from your perspective, how can we manage that so we don't let the ego take over everything else?
Well, ego is really important, but we're all on this grid, aren't we? If you could go from a 1 to 10, 1 where you are most like and MOUSE like, and a 10, a narcissist. You know, if you look, all of us are somewhere in that range. So when you ask the question, I know that I'm speaking out of my own level of ego, using that artificial grading system. So ego is critical. Ego, as I understand it, is a sense of confidence in what I can do as a gift of God. Now, that, of course, has real guardrails on it, doesn't it? Narcissism, which is the extreme, is being self-possessed, self-focused, self-interested. On the other level, mouse-like, where you have no sense, no appreciation for what God has gifted you to do, and no confidence in any gifts that you might have. I remember very interesting. I had a wonderful experience over my life of having some time with Billy Graham. And I dropped that name purposefully because it helps me with this story. They had his last major crusade here in Toronto, and I served as a co-executive chair. And so there was a lot of time together, and of course the volunteers all had their pictures taken with them, and we spent a few hours doing all of that stuff the day before the meetings. And I remember someone said to me, "Oh, Billy Graham is so humble, isn't he, Brian?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know whether he's humble or not. I don't know how he feels on the inside, but he practices humility." Humility is a discipline, it's a practice. That's why the scripture says, humble yourself. Humility isn't something you feel. Humility is something you exercise. And so for a person who is egoed or fairly high on the ego spectrum, it really matters that you practice humility. And humility is indeed a discipline, and a practice. Now, if you are fearful of the opportunity, and if you are marginalizing yourself by saying, I'm inadequate, I'm not good, I can't do this, and so forth, then I think you need a shot of God's ego where he reminds you that you are his child. He has gifted you and he has called you, and by his spirit, he will anoint you. So so maybe we can just use the same word, confidence, for ego. Confidence is that which is appropriate and needful when you're leading, whether you're leading 3 people or a congregation or a large organization. Now, I ended up at a bankrupt school now called Tyndale University in Toronto. It was the oldest Bible college in Canada. It had been formed in 1894. Yeah, 1894. And it was bankrupt. So I was involved with faculty that I had never led before. I had never been involved in an educational institution before, apart from my own training. And I got to tell you, Parong, that they scared the daylights out of me. I would go to a faculty meeting and my stomach was just in knots. And I had no confidence that they would follow what I, as a non-academic, would say or do. And I had to go through a series of steps to build confidence, even though I am not it's a psychologist to use the psychological framing. My sister calls me a type A, which means I get up in the morning and I kind of run hard. And I can be insensitive. Parong, you can tell your stories here if you like. I can be insensitive. I can be pushy. So not being confident is not one of my general attributes, but there I was scared. So confidence is something that is needful, it's appropriate, and it's essential in the leading responsibility. I'm not sure whether I'm coming anywhere close to what you're asking.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. You mentioned calling a few times. So I've heard that we need to listen based on our gifts. Maybe you can help us to try to understand giftings and calling. How does that link to each other, gifts, being the gifts and the calling?
If you have that book available to you, if not, it's on page 15. And what I did, and this is what I learned at that critical moment that I mentioned. I'm following from what Paul has noted, which are 7 gifts. This is Romans 12, 6 and 8. So the gifts, as I understand them, and I put them in my parlance: speaking, the ability to publicly speak; to serve and to help; 3, to teach; 4th, to encourage and to motivate; the 5th, to give; the 6th, to lead; and the 7th, to show mercy. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but my experience has been that these 7 gifts are fairly inclusive, that the other gifts that you might mention, I think, in my experience again, will be contained in one of these gifts. Again, I come back to how I learned this. Again, this is not something that is always obvious. If dominant gift is speaking, and you have excelled at that through your life, or you are excelling at it, and people recognize it, and you are called to do that as your prime activity within your life, then that's self-evident. For me, the self-evidence was there. I was deluded, frankly. I was raised at a time and in an environment where preaching is at the top of the food chain. I loved it. We had a church camp, and the church camp was not like you'd have a camp today. This was a church, it was a Bible conference at a church camp. And as a kid, I loved to go because I would hear 3 sermons a day. And for some strange reason, I loved preaching. I loved to listen to sermons. I would make notes even as a kid of sermons. And so as I grew, I aspired to be what was the top of the food chain, preaching. And I think it was simply an ego issue as I look back, a young ego issue. So I drove along that road and I found it was a bit of a dead end. And that's when I ended up ministry in Montreal, running a broken, bankrupt organization. That is my first primary calling at a time when my preaching gifts, in my view, weren't sufficiently appreciated, and I wasn't on people's call list. In other words, others didn't see what I thought I saw. And so it took me years to learn that there was something else in my life that God had gifted me to do, and that he wanted me to exercise for his glory, for the well-being of his church, and for the service of the gospel in the community. And that's when my own sense of calling, which had been framed by my ego and by my experience, didn't match what God had gifted me to do. It was painful. It was painful. Now, what I did learn in this gifting process is that I think that all of us have, of those. Now, let me just back off here. Each of these 7 gifts are resident in each of us. Each of us have the capacity to exercise each one of these gifts. Some are more multi-talented and have ability to operate in a number of gifts with effectiveness, and others are more singularly gifted and operate in 1 or 2. But my experience, and for me, I see 3 gifts as being dominant within the 7 gifts. And I learned this over time. I learned that leadership was what I was gifted to do. So, for example, when the school called, I remember Lily and I were at home watching the Blue Jays lose, September 1995. And they called and said, we need a new president. We have declared bankruptcy. Well, not quite bankruptcy. Canadian has a particular kind of law which gives you time to prepare a response to your creditors before you go bankrupt. So they were in that. If you're in America, the US is called Chapter 11. So, but I said no. And eventually they said, well, would you reconsider it? And of course I said, yes, I would. When I looked at that, I realized what needed to be done. I didn't know the details, but I looked at the organization. I knew what needed to be done because I'd done it before. There's a governance issue, board leadership. That was the prime issue. There was a vision issue. What was it vision? The Bible colleges at that point in North America were becoming something of the past. And our son had gone to Trinity Western, a Christian university, and I had seen the value of having a university that's within a Christian framework. So it was a governance issue. It was a vision issue, what they were envisioned to do, and it was a funding issue. So I knew what to do. But the other 2 gifts that have enabled me in the prime outworking of leadership have been these two: preaching. So preaching for me continues to be a love. One of the favorite that I read was called Preaching Parables to the Postmodern. Loved writing that book. I love preaching. I love preaching parables. So preaching. Now, sometimes people say, okay, we need you to come in and preach for this conference. And so that gift will be used at that particular moment because it serves their interests. But for me, preaching is a way of speaking and explaining my leadership ideas and turns and plans. So speaking as a gifting supported the leadership. The second gift that I have found to be dominant in my life is the gift of encouragement. So to encourage others. Now, it isn't that the other gifts don't apply. So if someone is in desperate need, I can exercise the gift of serving and helping. If somebody their marriage is on the rocks, I can exercise the gift of showing mercy. But don't have me for 2 counseling sessions for your marriage. One is about all I can manage, and by the time I finish my first one, I've got nothing more to say. You need to get somebody who's gifted in that area. My point is, we are gifted in all of these areas, but there are some that emerge to be dominant. And my experience is this, as I've worked with many other people in their gifting, is allow yourself to be surprised by what other people observe that maybe you've missed. Now, for me, when people observed that I had particular gifts in leadership, that's the last thing I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear them say, you have a gift of preaching, of speaking. They didn't do that. It was the latter. And eventually, I woke up and listened and found in time that to be a very satisfying, the exercising the gift to be a very satisfying experience. So Parang, let me use you as an example to our many friends who are listening, most of whom I've never met before, but I thank you for joining. Parang, interesting person she is. Chinese from Singapore, comes to Germany and marries a German and has 2 boys and does she's a theologian, and she ends up in our global organization, the World Evangelical Alliance. And what is she doing? Something she never imagined she would do. She didn't ask for this job, but she's Deputy General, Secretary General. She's leading because she's gifted at doing it. And the rest of us that work in this environment, we have seen these giftings. She's smart and sweet, but tough as nails when she has to be, and organized like we aren't. So it's interesting. So my point is simply this, Parang, is that we discover along the way, and again, this very simple elementary line, being in the way the Lord led. The silly metaphor, but so appropriate. It's hard to stay up on a still bicycle. It's hard to keep upright when the bicycle's going nowhere. But it's pretty easy when the bicycle's moving. And I find that with the Lord. If you don't know what to do, do something. If God hasn't told you what to do what comes to your hand. Do what you like to do. Because the Spirit is more interested in you celebrating the reign of God than you are, than I am. And what you do where you are is exactly that. You are celebrating the reign of God. Your life becomes the embodiment of that. It enables the reign to go forward, and it brings glory to the one who has created you, who has created me. So discover your gifts in the going. Now, there are various tests out now that help to exegete both the idea of gifting and your particular set of gifts, and to assemble and to understand. So understanding yourself, for me, it's been a wonderful journey. At 82 years of age, I'm still exegeting self and trying to figure out how I can serve the Lord where I am. And I'm at a particular moment now where I'm in the middle of starting a global podcast that I had no interest in doing. But one of our staff members, Joel Gordon, one day looked at me and he said, "Brian, this is what we need. We need a platform where evangelicals talk about issues, learn from each other. You know people, you've been on the way all these years. Do it." So we have just, I've been pulled screaming into doing this, and it's a new initiative. And again, I'm discovering things when everybody's asking me to retire, and I just don't feel I want to. There are things that can be done as you test, as you move forward. And later on, we're going to be talking about the role of faith, critical in the exercising of giftings, and the anticipation of the empowerment of the Spirit. That will come later, but it's very much entwined in all of this. Ron?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. It's funny that suddenly I'm part of your speech, but I'm happy to be your example. Today we talked a bit, or listened to you share with us your understanding of listening being a discipline that we all need, and how what we hear in many ways is related to our giftings. We spent some time thinking a bit about, are we really gifted, or is it our ego that is speaking? And we talked a bit about God, and you have a wonderful quote that Graham just helped us post about the Spirit being interested in celebrating the reign of God in and through us than we are. And I wonder, before I ask my question, if anybody else has any thoughts. I know that you, Pierre has asked a question, but since that's chapter 2, I will reserve that question for you, Brian, next week or next month when we talk about it. I wanted to end with this thing about finding your calling. You know, young people like me, we always think about YOLO, you only live once. You need to find our calling, the calling that God has gifted us with, and there's only a certain space and hole that only we can do. Yeah, while you say you have no formula and we have to find that broken wall, what happens? I mean, for every one broken wall that I work on, I miss out on the 9 broken walls. Yeah, there are opportunity costs. Maybe if you can share me a bit of your ideas of decision making on choosing the broken wall, choosing or understanding my call or finding my call. Because yeah.
So people ask, what's the will of God for me?
Yeah, essentially,
Well,
yes.
This is really important. It's been important for me to think about and to remind myself of this, which is God's will is always Jesus. Jesus is the expressed will of the Father. Jesus, the incarnate God, Jesus of Nazareth, is the will of the Father. Nothing matters as much to the Father in this world as Jesus does. Which means what God wants me to do is to live out the life of Jesus. So people think about God's will as doing this here, there, or doing that, there, over there. I believe that God leads us. I believe God wants us to operate out of the strength of our giftings, but we're all in different situations. If you're in Sudan right now, You don't have the opportunity, as I have, or as many of you have, in your place, of making more freely choices of what to do, who to work with, how to live your life. So we all live in different circumstances. So if somebody says to me, I miss the will of God, what they mean is they miss going there and doing that. That's not the will of God. Jesus is the will of the Father. And I'm not just being simplistic on that. I am being very focused on that kind of activity whereby we are living out the life of Jesus. And that is essential. So then you ask, of course, the question, what's the will of the Father for me in what I do vocationally and locationally? This is really critical. And I find that you work with others, you test, you train yourself. My experience for people who at some point in life somehow feel that they have lost out often is because they haven't disciplined themselves in their gifting to be of service. We are in desperate need of people who are disciplined and skilled in their gifting to serve the reign of God. So I go back to this very beginning of your gifting. Take time to train it, to discipline it, to refine it. Work hard at building the skills that are appropriate to the exercise of those gifts. Do that. And the Lord will find the right place for you. Be more concerned about being the will of the Father than in finding a job or a place or circumstance where you think you are in God's will. You and I are in God's will when we are living out the life of Jesus. Living out the life of Jesus is the will of the Father. Sorry for overemphasizing this, Parong, but we get so befuddled by thinking that God's will is what I do and where I go. That's not God's will. Jesus is God's will. So I can be anywhere, any place, with anyone, and be in the center of God's will as the life of Jesus is being lived through me. And I just, that's taking me so long to understand. Oh, how I wish in my early years I really understood that God's will was Jesus. And that the life of Jesus lived out in me is the will of the Father. That's what pleases the Father. To still find the right job and the right place and the right group to work with, those are incidentals. I know they become dominant. They become the front end of what I think about when I ask about the will of the Father. But if I can really in my life affirm that Jesus is the will of the Father and living out the life of Jesus as the will of the Father is the will of the Father for me. If I can believe that and say that to myself and really pray and act as if that is true, the Spirit is before us, He's behind us, He's around us. He cares that we do the right thing that serves and honors the Lord and honors the gifting He has put in on us. But remember, the Spirit, who is God, wills the same as the Father, that Jesus be predominant, be the will of the Father in our lives.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. This is like mic'd up or the mic down. This is amazing ending. Thank you very much for being inspiring. We joke, Brian and I, now that he has picked on me, I get to pick on him too. We joke, Brian and I, about how I'm half his age, so I'm all about wanting to glean from his experience. So this is us doing it on a public platform. Thank you very much, all of us who have joined us. if you have any ideas on what you want to hear, how this can be improved, and so on and so forth, I really think this is valuable, and I would love for more of us to share in this time together. I would love for your thoughts in this. And if not, just join us again next week, next month. I keep saying next week, next month. We are going to keep with the routine of the second Thursday of the month. So we will send out something again before that. So please join us. We are going to talk about the next principle, which is about recognizing opportunity in chaos. There is a question about vision there that Pierre brought up. Pierre, it would be great if you would join us again. I'm sure we would talk about that with more detail. Yeah, so thank you all of us. We are a bit early, but I think we have a lot of things to think about and chew on in the next few hours of our lives. This will be put on our YouTube channel, and we will send out a link once we have it. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much, Brian, for sharing with us your morning. I hope you have a very good rest of the day. All right. Bye-bye for now. Take care.